The evils of capitalism are nothing new. As far back as capitalism goes, there's always been people pushing it just a bit too far. Today we think of the evils of capitalism as the top 1% not letting their workers unionize, or not paying people a living wage while they buy their ninth yacht. But back in the day, the extremes of capitalism went a little further. One perfect example of this is the United Fruit Company. Now, you probably haven't heard of this company, but they're still sort of operating today, and you've probably even bought from them. However, they now operate under a different name, Chiquita. This sound more familiar? They are one of the biggest sellers and producers of bananas today, and they also have one of the darkest histories of any modern corporation. From sponsoring a coup to paying a terrorist organization to helping found one of the most controversial countries on the planet today, here is the story of the United Fruit Company. In 1871, an American railroad entrepreneur named Henry Meigs worked with the government of Costa Rica to build a new railroad from the major city of San Jose to a major port in the Caribbean. He was joined in this venture by his nephew, miner Cooper Keith, who took over control of the project in 1877 following his death. Shortly after Keith took over the business, he realized he needed a cheap way to feed his workers. He decided to give growing bananas a shot, which turned out to be even more successful than he originally anticipated. In 1890, the railroad finally opened, but the revenue, or money for the layman, was not enough to pay off Keith's debts. But he did make a lot of money by taking the bananas he grew, putting them on his train up to the port, and sending them by boat up to the United States. That was a successful move, but it didn't stay that way. In 1899, Keith lost $1.5 million when a broker in New York went bankrupt, putting the future of his company at risk. To ensure this didn't happen, he took a trip to Boston and merged his company, Tropical Trading and Transport Company, with a Boston-based fruit company creatively named Boston Fruit Company. This merger formed the United Fruit Company. This partnership added a bunch of new steamships to the company, as well as several plantations in the East Indies. Which, by the way, are nowhere near India because Columbus apparently didn't know how to use a map, but I digress. After the merger, the company proceeded to buy, in whole or in part, 14 other competitors. At this time, at the company's peak, they controlled 80% of the bananas going into the United States. By the mid-1930s, the United Fruit Company owned a grand total of 14,000 square kilometers in Central America and the Caribbean. All their land combined is about the size of the country of Montenegro. They were also the single largest landowner in Guatemala. This control over small countries actually led to the term Banana Republic being coined. It also led to the company gaining the nickname the Octopus, with tentacles that grabbed across the Caribbean Sea. Throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, the company faced two notable labor disputes. The first was in Colombia in 1928, and ended with the affectionately named Banana Massacre, where as many as 2,000 people may have been killed. The second dispute was in Costa Rica in 1934, and is now known as the Great Banana Strike. Many workers were threatened, some were deported, and it took years for the company to actually listen to them. So, it doesn't really sound that great, but whatever. It got so bad that the company convinced the governments that the strikes were actually a communist uprising, which the governments believed. In 1952, they turned up the dial a little bit. It was in 1952 that the government of Guatemala began taking unused lands from the United Fruit Company and giving it to the peasants that don't have land. The company responded completely proportionally by launching a misinformation campaign to make the CIA think that the government was communist. The CIA then went and did CIA things and overthrew the democratically elected president. And in their place, they left behind a military dictatorship that just so happened to be more sympathetic to the United Fruit Company. So yeah, say what you will about Amazon, but at least they never tried to overthrow the government of Guatemala, according to Google at least. In 1968, an American businessman named Eli M. Black bought over 733,000 shares of the United Fruit Company, making him the largest shareholder of the company. 2 years later, he merged the United Fruit Company with his meatpacking company AMK to create a new company called United Brands Company. The company had less cash on hand than Black originally anticipated, which only served to get worse as he ran up massive amounts of debt. But in September 1974, something happened that no one was prepared for. In September 1974, Hurricane Fifi touched down in Honduras, killing over 8,000 people in Honduras alone. It also caused damage in Belize, Guatemala, and El Salvador. It also damaged many of United Brand's banana plantations, drastically reducing the amount of bananas the company could sell. This hurt the company bad, and in February 1975, Black, distraught from the loss, killed himself by jumping out of a window of an office building in New York City. A few months later, the Securities and Exchange Commission of America discovered that United Brands planned to bribe the president of Honduras to get him to change some laws that would favor their business. On April 22nd, the president of Honduras was overthrown in a coup. In August 1984, the company changed its name to Chiquita Brands International, in part to get people to move past their awful history, which kind of worked, except then they had to go create their own new nightmares, but I'll get into that later. One way the company was able to achieve their strength was through having a massive fleet of over 25 ships. The company decided that a fleet of this size was too good to just be lugging bananas from Latin America to America, so they decided to expand their business model to include luxury Caribbean cruises. The boats were painted white to keep the temperatures lower, which would in turn help keep the bananas fresh. This led to these ships being known as the Great White Fleet. They also essentially held a monopoly on transportation in the region, with them owning nearly all the railroads in Central America. In 1913, the United Fruit Company created a new company called the Tropical Radio and Telegraph Company. They were able to use their wealth and influence to get tax breaks from these smaller governments, even though what they were doing was actually hurting the host countries. The environment, the economy, and the local farmers were all negatively impacted by United Fruit Company's practices. Let's go through those one by one. In order to build out plantations, you need infrastructure like sewage pipes, irrigation systems, housing, and a whole bunch of other stuff. The United Fruit Company would build this infrastructure by clear-cutting large areas of forests. They would also fill in much of the low-lying swamplands in the area. In order to create soil that was good for banana farming, they would also drain marshlands. Their farming practices were also often reckless and unsustainable. They would typically overwater the plants that need watering and just throw resources at the land to keep anything growing. This would eventually lead to soil fertility falling off dramatically. Once that happened and yields started to fall, the company would just leave the area and move on to somewhere else. The company was a virus, a cancer, a curse. They traveled the land causing damage, and once everything was thoroughly ruined, they would just move on. The United Fruit Company devastated the economy of Central America in a way that can still be felt today. They had their hooks in the government so deep that they had control over much of the economic activity that occurred. Any economist will tell you that a country's entire economy being reliant on the export of a single good is unsustainable and dangerous. For one, it meant if there were any shocks to the production of this good, such as a massive hurricane, then the entire economy would be harmed because of this. It also limited the country's ability to specialize in other areas or grow in any meaningful ways. Even now, many Central American countries are largely reliant on the export of agricultural products and low value-added goods to sustain their economies. But as I said before, soil fertility was devastated as a result of United Fruit Company's unsustainable agricultural practices. This means that these countries aren't producing at the levels they could have been if the United Fruit Company hadn't been such a greedy bowl of buttholes. The workers were paid extremely little, often barely enough to cover basic costs of living. They were forced to work long hours, with 12-hour shifts being far from uncommon. The conditions on these farms were also dangerous, with there being an excess of pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and other chemicals that farmers were not properly protected against. And it wasn't just the working conditions. The living spaces that the farmers were given were overcrowded, poorly built, and far away from any educational or recreational facilities. They also didn't have access to healthcare and often lacked sanitation, electricity, and clean water. Overall, the shifts were long, the lives were short, and the living conditions were cruel. Yeah, for some reason the company doesn't feel the need to include that in the Our Story section of their website. But that was a long time ago, right? Values changed and the company redeemed itself and they're just a super chill group of people now, right? Wrong. In March 2007, Chiquita admitted in a United States federal court to paying more than $1.7 million, roughly $2.6 million today, to a group called the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. This group has been labeled as a terrorist organization by the United States since 2001. The company was ordered to pay a fine of $25 million in restitution. Now, as you can all clearly tell, I'm something of a math genius, so I broke down some numbers for you. The company's revenue for 2007 was $3,465,000,000, which means the company made an average of $9,493,150 a day. That means the company made back the money they had to pay in just 2.6 days. Chiquita admitted during these processes that they paid the group to threaten union organizers and force farmers to sell only to Chiquita. The company has also been accused of smuggling 3,000 AK-47s to the group, as well as helping the group smuggle drugs into Europe. So yeah, not exactly the best group. And just to be clear, this is also not in the company's Our Story page. And I know a lot of you are thinking, well, what company would include something that terrible on their own webpage? Well, Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, listed working for the Nazis on their webpage, and they're the ones who developed Zyklon B, which is the pesticide that was used in the gas chamber at the concentration camps. So Chiquita's unwillingness to mention their past on their homepage is a weak attempt to hide their unpleasant history. Now, I just want to take a minute to talk about something that's completely non-controversial that I'm sure everyone will be super chill about: Palestine. In 1933, Sam Zemurray became CEO of the United Fruit Company. He was born in Russia and lived in a poor Jewish community before moving to America when he was 14. He started his own small banana company and eventually rose through the ranks to become CEO of United Fruit Company. In 1947, when the UN held the vote to form the State of Israel and split Palestine into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Zemurray used his influence in Latin America and the Caribbean to get several countries such as Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, and Haiti to vote in favor of the separation. Overall, more countries from Latin America voted in favor of the separation than any other region. Out of the 33 countries that voted in favor of the separation, 13 were Latin American. Many companies have done terrible things, from hiding the damages their products have done to the health of the users and to the health of the planet, but few companies can say that they helped pave the road for one of the most ruthless and deadly conflicts since World War II. So remember, every time you see a Chiquita banana with a little sticker on it with a picture of a minion, remember what they've done. Remember what they've done to the people of Palestine. Remember what they did to the people and land of Central America. Remember the damage they did to this world, and do not give them your money. The world needs to show Chiquita we remember what they've done, and they can't outrun it forever. Thank you all for listening, and goodbye.